the Discobolus of Myron, arguably the most famous statue in the world. But where is it? The original cast in bronze has long been lost. That loss is mitigated only by the marble copies of the Roman period. When we refer to the Discobolus, we usually have in mind one or all of these Discoboli. They're collectively representative of an ancient artwork that is principally famous these days, let's face it, as an image of sport rather than of art. Other possible contenders for the title of most famous world sculpture are handicapped, it could be said, by their lack of sportiness. The Venus de Milo, for example, and Antigorm's Angel of the North both have what we might call arm issues. An ancient sculpture that in antiquity was even more famous than the Discobolus was the standing or perhaps walking youth who does not carry the athlete's javelin, but the heavier spear of war. The Doryphoros was executed in bronze around 440-430 by master bronze worker Polykleitos of Argos. This ideal representation of youthful male beauty famously relied for its effect upon an arrangement of limbs and muscles into a biomechanical system of weight-bearing and weight-free, engaged and disengaged, stretched and contracted, tense and relaxed, raised and lowered parts. Every element, it was said, of Polykleitos' composition was constructed according to a precise set of measurements, calculated to represent perfection. The sculptor even went so far as to write a treatise called the Canon, explaining the statue, something which was more common among architects, seeking to explain technical aspects of their buildings. Polykleitos' treatise, like the original bronze, has not survived, but something of the impression it made on the eye can be derived from Roman copies, mostly in marble. This bronze reconstruction is based upon several Roman copies in marble, but also the bronze bust in the from the Villa dei Papiri in the Naples Archaeological Museum. It was made before the Second World War by the German sculptor Georg Römer, and it's almost by every recent book on ancient Greek sculpture said to have been destroyed during the Second World War, but in fact it survived the bombing of the university building that was destroyed and resurrected, and the statue is now back on show at the top of the stairs with minor damage to its face and the loss of its spear. Polykleitos trained in the workshop of Argalidas of Argos, and it did another sculptor of the 5th century BC, Myron. As an illustration of an ancient sporting event, the discus thrower is often taken to represent a real discus throw, frozen, as it were, in mid-action. But is it so? Close analysis of the composition of the discus thrower, at least in its principal aspect, indicates a synthesis of elements artificially assembled as a series of binary opposites, like those of the Doryphoros, to convey an abstract idea of the athletic male body. Its major features comprise one arm that extends behind, holding the discus, while the other arm hangs free. The torso is turned to face the viewer, while the legs and buttocks are in profile. One leg bears the weight, while the other is weight-free. The toes of the right engaged leg arch up, while the toes of the other leg curl under, both sets of toes seemingly charged like compressed springs, ready to release stored energy. Elements that are held under tension, the Greek word is entasis, contrast with those that are relaxed, and together they comprise a set of intersecting lines that describe the arc and string of a bow drawn to the point of releasing an arrow. Bios, as the saying went, life is a bow. The metaphor appears in the corpus of medical tracts associated with that father of modern medicine, Hippocrates of Kos. One bone setter likens properly adjusted limbs to the push and pull of a drawn bow, in which opposite forces are balanced one against another. In this image of the Lancelotti version of the sculpture, the pose is made explicit with the added lines of a drawn bow. All this is predicated on there being a single intended viewpoint for Myron's masterpiece. The pose of the figure we read is cut in one plane, for a single viewpoint, like high relief, without a background. Another art historian regards any other viewpoint as a muddle of confused shapes. But is it so? I'm not convinced the difference between the frontal and other views, I believe, is one of a contest between art and nature, the canonical view being art, this and other views nature. Whatever was in Myron's head when he created the discus thrower, it has since taken on a range of modern meanings, from political symbol to homoerotic emblem of the cult of the Greek male body beautiful. And here is a sign of things to come. The pleasure park of Tivoli, of the 2nd century AD Emperor Hadrian, was a place where Greek ideas and Greek art were preserved and imitated. Tivoli once boasted great quantities of statuary copied in marble from Greek originals. In the 18th century, the excavation of these sculptures and their restoration fed a thriving market in antique sculpture, much of which was bought by English collectors. The trade was legal and subject to control by the Pope's own antiquary, who dictated what should go and what should stay and arranged for the issue of export licenses. The important collector and connoisseur Charles Townley went 3 times to Italy on what is loosely called the Grand Tour, and when in England he kept up a frequent correspondence with the dealers he had met in Rome, principally Thomas Jenkins and Gavin Hamilton. His sculptures came to the British Museum in 1805, a collection of drawings illustrating his and other collections, and his archive of letters and other documents came later, and together provide a unique insight into Townley's world. Of all the antiquities in Charles Townley's London House Museum in Park Street, Westminster, the marble Roman copy of Myron's bronze 5th century masterpiece is surely the most famous. The Discobolus was the last major acquisition of sculpture that Charles Townley was to make. It arrived in 1794 and was prominently displayed in this watercolour of Townley's dining room by William Chambers. A more fanciful depiction of Townley's Ménage is the celebrated portrait by Johann Zoffany, largely complete by 1790. The artist returned from India to his canvas to add the Discobolus to the bottom left-hand corner of the picture in 1798. And there he's watched by Cam, Townley's favourite dog, in the eternally vain hope that the athlete might one day release the projectile. On the 24th of March 1781, some 10 years before the discovery of the Townley Discobolus, Thomas Jenkins had written to Charles Townley of the recent discovery of a different version of the statue. He writes, "In the Villa Palombara, near Santa Maria Maggiore, the Marchesi Massimi has just found a fine statue of a Discobolus in great preservation and an action quite new." Jenkins was referring to the statue known now as the Lancelotti Discobolus, first displayed in the Palazzo Massimo delle Colonne and later removed to the Palazzo Massimo Lancelotti in the Via dei Coronari. It's now in the Museo Nazionale in Rome, where it's exhibited with the more recent find of the version from Castel Porziano. Townley received a sketch by Tommaso Piroli, I think this one, an artist better known for his printmaking after old master paintings. Before the Lancelotti Discobolus was found complete with its head, there had been previous attempts at restoring fragmentary torsos. 3 examples of especially fanciful restorations are to be found in Charles Townley's collection of drawings. There is this fallen so-called gladiator in Rome's Capitoline Museum. The original fragment is said to have been known to the Renaissance and is supposed to have been restored by Pierre-Étienne Monod in the early 18th century. Another torso of the Discobolus had once been restored as Endymion, blinded by the moon, as seen in this drawing. A second restoration, overseen by the painter Anton Raphael Mengs, cut away the dog so that the statue could join the famous group of Naiads in the Uffizi Palace in Florence. The version restored is Diomedes with the Palladion in one hand, turning back with a dagger in the other, famously went to the second Earl of Shelburne, first Marquess of Lansdowne, sold to him by the painter and dealer Gavin Hamilton. It was found at Ostia, the port of ancient Rome, in 1772. The Lansdowne collection was sold off and dispersed long ago. The Diomedes, though, is one of very few sculptures to remain in the Lansdowne collection and is at Bowood in Wiltshire. The very restorations that Gavin Hamilton thought so right have long seemed absurd and made it hard to sell. Not only are the arms and legs restored, but also the head is ancient, but alien. Townley knew nothing of the Diomedes until he received a letter from Hamilton declaring the sale to Shelburne as a fait accompli. This image was sketched in the letter itself and is a rare autograph drawing by Gavin Hamilton. Anyway, Townley did well to wait for his Discobolus, which was found after the discovery of the Lancelotti Massimi version and was therefore correctly identified, but not quite correctly restored. The Townley Discobolus was excavated at Hadrian's Villa in 1790 or early 1791 and was restored by the Italian sculptor Carlo Albercini and sold by Thomas Jenkins to Townley for £400. For the most part, the Townley Discobolus is ancient, but the head does not belong. Jenkins was to maintain throughout the purchase negotiations that the head was the original and appears to have persuaded Townley. In fact, it belongs to a type of Hermes bending over to tie his sandal. Not only does the head not belong to the Discobolus, but it is also wrongly placed to look forward instead of back. This is in contradiction of the evidence of the Lancelotti version shown here in another drawing by, this time, Vincenzo Dolcibene. There is also the ancient description of the 2nd century AD author Lucian, who explicitly says that the head was turned towards the discus. It's indicative, though, of the confidence that Jenkins and others had in the restoration of the Townley Discobolus that they were happy to see the head of the Pope's Discobolus restored with a modern copy of the head attached to the Townley version. The Pope's Discobolus was found about the same time as the Townley version and also said to come from Hadrian's Villa. Such restorations would not be carried out today, but we should judge them not by today's standards, but by those of the 18th century. Collectors of so-called grand tour sculpture expected it to be complete, even if this meant a considerable percentage of restoration. There was also a belief that the Romans, when they copied original Greek works, felt obliged to improve upon them. The 18th century restorers saw themselves as inheritors of this tradition, as the Pope's Antiquary Visconti was to put it, as producers of imitation perfectionnée. After a long delay, Jenkins wrote to say that the awaited export license for the Townley Discobolus had just been issued. The main reason for the sudden release of the permit was fear of a French invasion and the consequent need for the Vatican to cultivate Britain as an ally. To quote Jenkins, "They look upon England as the only power that can check the extension of French principles and conquest, and Prince Augustus, being lately arrived, has so flattered His Holiness at his insistence there is scarcely anything he would not do to prove his desire to please the English." The Catholic tendencies of the sixth son of His Majesty King George III, here portrayed by Guy Head, were to land the prince in trouble. He became estranged from his father when the king declared his Catholic marriage void. In invoking the prince's name, Jenkins is of course aware that Townley was himself a Catholic. Already then, in the 18th century, we find Myron's Discobolus playing an unexpected role in international politics. It was to happen again and famously or notoriously in 1938 when Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film promoting the 1936 Berlin Olympics featured the Lancelotti Discobolus turning into the German decathlete Erwin Huber. The Nazis bought the statue itself from the Lancelotti family on the 18th of May 1938 for a reported $327,000 US dollars, about 5 or 6 million Deutschmarks, and installed it in the Munich Glyptothek. After the war, President Truman's administration, presiding over the repatriation of artwork saluted by the Nazis, insisted that the sculpture be repatriated to Rome. German academics pointed out that it had been purchased, but the American military government and the liberated Italian intelligentsia were adamant it would go back, not to the Lancelotti, but to the Museo Nazionale. It arrived in November 1948. In the summer of that very same year, London had held its ration book or austerity Olympics as part of the publicity for the 1948 London Games. A transport poster was commissioned from the designer Walter Hertz, the chief artist of Heroes Publicity Studios. Their firm was based at 37 Museum Street, very close to where we are. We see the Townley Discobolus hovering over the Olympic insignia with the Palace of Westminster behind. The hands of the dial on Big Ben are at 4 o'clock, the hour of the start of the Games. The message is clear, and its symbolic value could not be more different from the Nazi appropriation for propaganda of the Lancialotti Discobolus. The Houses of Parliament represent the world's oldest continuous democracy. The Discobolus represents the idea of political and intellectual freedom traditionally associated with the ancient Greeks, and the Olympic insignia reference not only the Games, but also a world restored to peace. Since 1948, the Townley Discobolus has acted variously as a sign of the Olympic movement, as a token of the ancient Games, and as a homoerotic paradigm of the athletic male body. From 1980, it has featured in a 4-year cycle of shows at the British Museum, organised by my colleague Judith, illustrating the ancient Olympics to coincide with the modern Games. In 2004, the Games were celebrated in Athens, and it was the Townley Discobolus that featured on the commemorative €2 coin. The enduring popularity of the Townley Discobolus and its appearance where we might have expected to find the Lancialotti has, I think, in great part to do with the fact that while other versions were less exposed to the public gaze, the Townley has been on almost permanent display since it was first acquired and has been made accessible through casts and through engravings. Even in the field of athletics itself, the Townley version with its alien head looking the wrong way has been taken as a paradigm of the ancient technique of discus throwing. Here's Robert Garrett in an instance where life imitates art in the 1896 Games in Athens. In 2008, the Townley Discobolus travelled abroad during the Beijing Olympics and was shown in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Following the Beijing Olympics, the British Museum's Discobolus became the star object in an international touring exhibition, which has perhaps inevitably acquired an alternative title of The Greek Body Beautiful. My own projected title for the exhibition was The Human Body in Greek Art and Thought, which now looks rather pie. When the Discobolus, this is the Discobolus emerging from packing cases, when the Discobolus completes its tour, perhaps with the Brazil Olympics of 2016, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people all over the world who might never have seen it will have had the opportunity to become acquainted with it at first hand. Meanwhile, the Discobolus enjoys an ever-increasing fame in popular culture, and here are some of my favourite internet images. Marilyn Monroe hugs a cast of the Vatican Discobolus. Time Out reverses the Lancialotti and tattoos it in the modern manner. This is by Vitaly Komar and Alexander Malamid in 1983, two Australian artists, and seems to have everything that has been attributed to the Discobolus. And this Kim Abela Ojida's African Discobolus. I've recently become interested in the work of the Chinese sculptor Cui Jianguo. He teaches in the Beijing Academy of Fine Arts and is one of a number of celebrity Chinese sculptors who've emerged in recent years. Best known, of course, is the controversial Ai Weiwei. Visitors to The Hague a couple of summers ago could see a Cui one-man show in the Belden and Zee Museum. Most striking was his slant paradise. Its scene is taken from a contemporary Dutch souvenir plate and modelled in 3D. It is suspended from the ceiling of a gallery displayed at an angle approximate to that at which it would be seen if viewed from China. Yeah, whatever. Attractive as this installation is, the pieces that interest me most are those that seem to have a classical, more specifically a Neoplatonic resonance. There is, for example, deposit memory, where a raw lump of unworked marble is locked in an iron cage, or sealed memory, where the created object is hidden in its own plinth of distressed iron. Sway has a particular interest in what we call the Mao suit, or the Chinese call it the legacy mantle, as well as sculpting it to represent a powerful image in its own right. He dresses familiar naked sculptures to create an imprisoned object in the same vein as his other work. And then again, there's his business-suited gathering of discoboly, which appears to reference Chinese industrial mass production. This gathering was featured in Hong Kong to mark the Beijing Olympics. It's just one of several experimental works adapting the Discobolus. Here the figure is modelled in reverse and exhibited against a mirror which reverses the reversing. I'm somewhat reminded of the work of Ian Hamilton Finlay, the British Museum's Westmacott athlete, plaster cast with an anti-tank gun in aluminium foil, last seen at the David Nolan Gallery with a price tag of $90,000. Sway's creative adaptations of familiar icons in the canon of European art is inspired by the experience of Xu Beihong, teacher and painter who studied European art in Paris during the 1930s and brought back with him a number of plaster casts of important sculptures. During the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the casts acquired by Xu were relegated to the basement of the Beijing Academy of Fine Arts, where they were to be rediscovered by Sui Qianguo. Among his works derived from the casts is Sui's striking and beautiful Discobolus in a legacy mantle, a version of which you can find displayed in room 3 upstairs. At first glance, the position of the head might lead us to believe that this is based on a cast of the Townley Discobolus. A closer look at the tree stump reinforcing the left leg, though, shows that it is the Vatican version with the head copied from the Townley version. This sculpture had been part of the loot that Napoleon displayed in the Louvre when he occupied Rome. After Waterloo, the Discobolus was restored to the Vatican, but not before a mould was made from which one day a cast would be supplied to Xu Beihong. This piece shares the theme in Sway's work of a subject wrapped, caged, or otherwise contained and restricted by an alien force, in this case the uniform of Communist China, betokens the loss of freedom of the human spirit. Occasionally that spirit sounds its protest and breaks its bonds. Untitled, this work is reminiscent of other screams in Western art, Francis Bacon's Screaming Pope, or the Scream of Edward Munch, or is that the Munch by Edward Scream? Just to end, I would like to speculate on who the discus thrower was in antiquity. He's usually assumed to be an anonymous victor monument, but there is no ancient source to suggest that he was. And I wonder if he wasn't actually part of one of Marsyas's tableaux. Marsyas went in for group sculptures, and here are the two Roman versions of his now lost Marsyas and Athena, the Vatican Marsyas and the Athena in Frankfurt in the Liebig House. He also created an introduction of Heracles to Olympus with Athena and Zeus and the hero in a tripartite tableau. There is in the museum a 2nd century AD seal stone with a crude representation of the discus thrower, and it is inscribed Hyacinthos. Hyacinthos was the boy loved by Apollo and Zephyros. Zephyros, the west wind, was wounded by the refusal of his attentions, and Apollo was the preferred successful lover of Hyacinthos. Zephyros took murderous revenge on the pair when they were practicing discus, and he blew the discus into the head of Hyacinthus. All this would be tragic if it weren't rather funny. Thank you very much.